In the 13th century, Scotland would become the focus of the Christian world. Its throne was without an heir, its people at the brink of civil war. It was a time when the nation's heroes were forged, and one would rise to become forever remembered as the greatest King of Scots. This is the story of Scottish nobleman Robert Bruce and his ruthless campaign for the Scottish crown. In a time of bloody war, he would leave a legacy both of a heroic king and a traitorous killer, and prove that history is made by those with the will to succeed at any cost. It's January of 1306. Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale, Earl of Carrick, has been visiting his estates in England. But tonight, he has received word that Edward, King of England, means to arrest him. His life in danger, he must return as quickly as he can to Scotland, a land he seeks to rule, but for now, one which he may never see again. Scotland is a nation in the midst of the most turbulent time in its history. It's without a leader and under the authority of the English and their king, Edward I.
In 1306, Scotland was an English conquest, essentially. It was a mere pentacle of English administration and government. The country had been well and truly and savagely conquered by Edward I of England.
Edward didn't even describe Scotland as a kingdom. It was the land of Scotland, absolutely a part of England, the same as Wales and Ireland was. And yeah, as far as Edward was concerned, that was it. No more kingdom.
Scotland's downfall began years earlier. In 1286, the reigning King Alexander III fell to his death as he journeyed through the night. Soon after, the sea claimed his only surviving heir, when his granddaughter, Margaret, Maid of Norway, was killed by the harsh voyage to Scotland. By 1290, Scotland was a country without a leader.
When Alexander, our king, was dead, our gold was turned into lead. I mean, it really is a sort of poignant turning moment.
The Maid of Norway unfortunately died en route to Scotland from Norway. The plan was that she should marry the future Edward II, and thus a dynastic union would come about, and a union of Scotland and England would have happened hundreds of years before it actually did.
There's got to be the idea that a king will come and occupy that throne in the near future, and that's the huge problem for the Scots.
With King Alexander's line at an end, the throne of Scotland was empty. From all sides, factions emerged, claiming they now had the right to the Scottish crown.
In total, 13 individuals put in a bid for the Scottish kingship.
And there were clearly two candidates that were the strongest. That was John Baleal and Robert Bruce, the grandfather of the later king. So they were ready for it, and they had the strongest claim.
At this time, Robert Bruce is a young man, not yet head of his family, but well aware of the situation therein.
I think to look to the future, you have to look to Bruce's early life, and particularly to his family. I mean, it must have been extraordinary growing up in Turnberry and the other Bruce properties, with the influence of his grandfather, the competitor.
I think he would have perhaps been quite a playboy, because we know for certain that he was quite a tournament champion, and that Edward I himself had actually befriended the young Robert Bruce because he was very impressed with his military skills.
The young Robert Bruce was a man with a bright future, heir to titles and lands in both Scotland and England. In a time of chivalry, he was fast gaining a reputation as one of the finest knights in Christendom. And if his family's claim was recognised, he was soon to be heir to a kingdom.
Have a drink with me.
The head of the Bruce family, at the time of the Great Cause as it's known, was Robert Bruce. Robert Bruce, the competitor.
I think he must have been the most remarkable of men, a man who'd gone on crusade, a great landowner both in England and in Scotland, a man who obviously had incredible influence on his grandson and fed into the young Robert Bruce the belief that the Bruce claim to the throne was not only the strongest, but also one that had to be prosecuted.
But the path to the throne is far from clear. John Baleal, Lord of Galloway, claims the kingship through his mother, the cousin of Bruce the competitor. and he has support from Bruce's rivals, the powerful Cowan family.
John.
Welcome to our most humble dwelling.
Good to see you.
Good journey?
The Baleals and the Cowans are allies and close confederates.
John Baleal, his sister Eleanor, married John Cowan, Lord of Badenoch. It was an alliance of tremendous importance for both families. The Baleals brought a very good royal connection. So when that was allied to the Cowans, who had virtually viceregal powers in northern Scotland, those two combinations made for a really dynamic political force.
With Scotland unable to decide whose claim is stronger, the nation threatens to descend into civil war. Only an authority from out with the realm could decide on the rightful successor, and the Scots chose a man who had always been a friend to the country, the brother-in-law of their dead king, Edward I of England.
Do we have the favour of the king?
Longshanks.
Well, the Scots had to find somebody outside of Scotland to make that decision. Edward is a great lawmaker in European terms. He's their nearest neighbour. It made a lot of sense.
Edward I, I suppose, was something of an imperialist. He had big French interests. He'd been conducting campaigns to reconquer Aquitaine, and he had famously, of course, absolutely hammered the Welsh. I mean, here you have to wonder at the Scots.
In 1291, Edward gathered the nobles of Scotland together to decide the future of their country. But the Scots were quickly put in no doubt that the man who had been invited as a friend saw his role differently.
I am the feudal superior of the Scottish realm, and I will judge this by the letter of the law.
For Edward, Scotland is no longer an ally. It's a relationship that ended with the death of her king.
When Alexander dies, that personal tie is gone. And you just see Edward, you know, the wheels going round, and I'm thinking, right, let's just acquire Scotland, or at least good control over Scotland while we've got the opportunity.
Edward I at this point is thinking of conquest of Scotland, of adding Scotland to the English Empire.
In case the Scots have any thought of resisting his authority, Edward has amassed a powerful army at the border.
I think it made no difference at all to Edward I whether Robert the Competitor inherits the throne or whether John Baleal gets the job. I think it makes no difference to him at all. He intends to undermine whoever becomes King of Scots.
Edward's interest in the throne made much of Scotland wary, but the Bruces were depending on their personal history with the English king.
I think at the time they were expecting Edward to proclaim them as suitable for being kings of Scots.
Well, Bruce the Competitor, of course, he'd been on crusade along with Edward I had been on crusade, you know, so they'd been buddies in arms, if you like.
Edward had a great respect for the achievements of Bruce the Competitor, and perhaps he saw certain of these characteristics being reborn in the grandson.
But old friendship isn't enough to sway the English king. To the Bruces' dismay, Edward finds in favour of John Baleal. He will become John I, the next king of Scots.
Edward's choice of Baleal for the Scottish throne is based entirely on the legal conditions of the day. Primogeniture, the firstborn son inherits, and John Baleal is the closest to being a firstborn son to the later Alexander III.
I think most people agreed that Baleal had the best claim, although the Bruces were later to argue, very forcefully indeed, that Edward had deliberately chosen Baleal, although the real candidate should have been Bruce.
To the Bruces, it's clear that Edward I, with his own designs on Scotland, has placed the weaker man on the throne.
Well, the problem for Baleal is the fact that Edward has the whole thing sewn up. You know, there is almost no room for whoever was picked to manoeuvre.
He doesn't seem to be impressive in terms of his personality, his dynamism. He's not a military leader. He doesn't introduce anything radically new. So it's quite a tepid kingship in that sense. And the question mark must be, is he really in charge?
What you've also to think about with Baleal is the hand of the Commons behind him. Baleal is not terribly au fait with Scottish politics, but the Commons are right in there, and they would be advising him as to how he should proceed.
The reign of John Baleal begins in 1292, but history remembers a king without power. He's dominated by his supporters, the Common family, and Edward's interference in Scottish affairs makes any effective kingship impossible.
Edward was always pushing it, and the final straw that broke the camel's back really was when Edward declared war on the French.
Edward sends out a summons to various Scottish magnates, that's great lords, and Scottish king, to supply him with troops, with men-at-arms, to go to war against France.
The Scottish army was meant to be a defensive force, a militia to defend the kingdom. It was not meant to fight overseas, and he just refused. And that was what brought the wrath of Edward I down on his head.
Far from following Edward to war, Scotland makes a treaty with France. A call to arms is announced. The Scots are to throw off an unwanted English overlord. But not all Scots rally to the king. For the Bruces, this is a Baleal war, and they will not fight under their rival's banner. Instead, they side with the English forces. It's the first of many acts that mean the story of the Bruces has always been tinged with accusations that they were traitors.
The idea that Bruce was a traitor is another complete misunderstanding of the medieval existence, if you like.
It was practical politics to aim to get a stronger alliance, and if that happened to be with the King of England, and if that helped the Bruces or the Cummins in their situation in Scotland, that was not hesitated about.
I don't think that the Bruces had any interest in supporting the Baleal regime, if I can put it that way. They were obviously alienated to a degree from Baleal and his supporters.
The Bruce family, this time Robert Bruce the father, submits to Edward just before he invades Scotland. He crosses the border towards Berwick and Dunbar. And it's likely that Robert Bruce, the man who will become king, is possibly part of that force. He certainly submits along with his father.
In March of 1296, the forces of Edward move into Scotland. Before all-out war begins, one of the last acts of King John Baleal is to punish what he sees as the rebellion of the Bruces.
They were working for Edward I. The penalty for that was that they lost their lands in Scotland, which were given, ironically I suppose, to their enemies, the Cummins.
We must always remember that their estates in England were much larger than those in Scotland, and one of the prime motivators in medieval history is the acquisition and, more importantly, the retention of land. They must have seen that the future was brighter to the south than it was in the barbarian north.
For the young Robert Bruce, it's an early chance to put his military training into practice. The Bruces are to hold the English castle of Carlisle against the Scots.
It is, I think, very interesting that the first hostile act during the Wars of Independence was John Comyn leading a Scottish army against Carlisle Castle, and the two people who were defending Carlisle Castle on behalf of Edward I were Robert Bruce and his father.
There hadn't been a war in Scotland of any size or any importance for 3 generations, so there was rather a shortage of hardened veterans hanging about the place, nobody who knew how to really run an army.
What is always so astonishing is the confidence of the Commons, because they're leading this army, when they raid into England. And then, of course, it's like a balloon. It bursts like that.
The Baleal strategy dissolved very quickly and was not one that would have recommended itself to support in the first place.
After the Bruces repel the Comyn-led attack into England, Edward's forces face no significant resistance as they advance into Scotland. At the southern Scottish outpost of Berwick, Edward decides to show the Scots he will not take their revolt lightly.
Edward I camped his army outside Berwick and summoned the town. That means called on the town to surrender. The inhabitants of the town declined to do so, so the very next day the town is taken by storm by Edward's army.
The people of Berwick refuse to surrender, and an enraged Edward offers no mercy. Women and children are slaughtered alongside the men as Berwick becomes a massacre.
You know, the memory of Berwick sits in the folk psyche and the common memory, you know, for a very long time. And it kind of, unfortunately, is supremely indicative of the horror of this war and the fact that it destroys any friendly relationship between Scotland and England for centuries after that.
Within only 4 months, the ruthless English king has the Scots beaten. King John Baleal is left no option but abject surrender.
He surrenders his kingship to Edward I, which means that Edward I is his successor as King of Scots.
There's a sort of ceremony or an anti-ceremony where the coat of arms, the emblems of Scotland, are physically torn off Baleal, and he is forced to get down on his knees and beg for forgiveness for the terrible crimes he's committed.
For John Baleal, his humiliating surrender becomes the defining moment of his life. He survives in history as the pathetic figure of Toom Tabard.
It's a very sad nickname that Baleal rejoices in, Toom Tabard, empty coat. And that's what it means. He was the useless king.
No king, no sovereign could have survived as a leader of his nation in those circumstances, and so he's off and into exile.
It's ritual humiliation, okay, of the person of John Baleal, but it's the kingship of Scotland and the ancient kingdom of Scotland that is being trodden on the ground that day.
With Baleal in exile, his reign continues in name only. But the Scots are again without a leader. It's now that the Bruces see the opportunity to move for the crown once again.
There is a story that after the deposition of Baleal, Bruce's father came along to Edward I and said, "Do you want now to reconsider our bid for the kingship?" And Edward said, "Have we nothing to do but win kingdoms for you?"
The Bruces felt slighted, obviously, that they had missed this opportunity for the throne of Scotland.
And I think at that moment, not only the Bruces, but I think the Scots realised that Edward was not going to leave. It was not just a question of removing Baleal, it was a question actually of removing the sovereignty of Scotland completely. And from then on, Scotland would merely be ruled as a province of England in the same way as Wales had now become.
In 1296, the Bruces are the villains in the story of Scottish freedom. Focused on the crown, they had fought for the King of England against the King of Scots. At this stage in his life, Robert Bruce has shown little to indicate the near-legendary leader he would become.
Well, of course, in 1296, Robert Bruce was still not head of his family. Although the old competitor had died then, his father was head of the House of Bruce, and the young Robert Bruce wasn't really in command of what he was doing.
It's under Edward's instructions that Robert Bruce journeys back to Scotland in 1297.
The young Robert Bruce was sent north to deal with a rebellion by Sir William Douglas and to put this rebellion down.
It must have occurred to him, certainly it would have occurred to his father very directly, that King Edward was no longer interested in re-establishing an independent monarchy in Scotland. And so to that extent, the Bruces could not look to King Edward for support for their claim to the throne. It now fell to them.
But in Scotland, the climate has changed. A nationalistic feeling is on the rise, finding focus in an unlikely but strong leader, William Wallace.
William Wallace is the second son of a minor West Coast knight in Scotland, but he's obviously someone who's quite charismatic, quite forceful, and perhaps quite an outlaw figure even before the English invade and take over.
The first beginnings of Robert Bruce, as one of the chroniclers calls it, occurs when William Wallace initiates his rising, and at that point he's joined by Robert Bruce, the future king, who says that no man will stand against his own flesh and blood, etc., and he must join the nation to which he belongs.
He got swept along in the tide of excitement that was around at the time of Wallace and his rebellion, and he decides personally that that's what he would like to do.
And this is remarkable. This is what he should not do, exactly what he should not do, because this is to possibly forfeit all the important possessions of the Bruces. And
so we see him coming out in support of the Scots in an effort to re-establish an independent kingdom, and that is the beginning of his struggle for independence.
You have surrendered.
Wallace forever enshrines his name in Scottish history with victory over an English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge.
He's quite lucky in some senses in achieving a great victory at Stirling in 1297, along with another noble son, Andrew Murray, and in some senses by default then finds himself sole leader the Scottish army when Murray dies of his wounds.
He's para-historical, he transcends the centuries. He's almost a myth, although he was a real man at the same time.
Wallace's legend has grown through the years. A giant of a man, a military genius, a patriot without compromise. But the beginning of the end for Wallace comes in 1298, when he is defeated at the Battle of Falkirk by the English, this time commanded by Edward I himself.
He defeated a smaller English army at Stirling, but when the English king, Edward I, came north with the biggest army that would be serving in the British Isles until the 18th century, it was definitive.
Contemporaries could never understand how it was that the dazzling victor at Stirling Bridge lost at Falkirk a year later, and the earliest chroniclers to report the event came up with the explanation that it was treachery. The treachery of the Scottish nobility in general, and of John Comyn and Robert Bruce in particular.
We do know that at the time of Falkirk, or immediately after, Bruce was down in the southwest of Scotland, actually laying waste his land ahead of the retreating English army. So it's very unlikely that he was fighting against the Scots.
Scottish chroniclers would try to excuse Wallace's loss at Falkirk, but pitched against the English army, Wallace's forces were outclassed, and against the seasoned general Edward I, Wallace was up against a better military tactician. By the end of 1298, Robert Bruce finds himself on the losing side, with King Edward as the major obstacle to any new claim to the throne. The promise of Wallace's revolt is gone, and Scotland is again leaderless. Now the Scots resort to a system of guardians, old enemies drawn together to face a common foe.
The Guardians of Scotland were a form of regency, essentially a council that came to take authority in the absence of a monarch.
In 1298, after the demise of Wallace, Robert Bruce becomes co-guardian of Scotland along with John Comyn. Very interesting situation developing here. This brings Bruce very close to the centre of power, of course, but also he has to work alongside an enemy.
That's a great achievement for Bruce, because he's a bit of an outsider here. The Commons are the main political family, and the fact that he's got to a power-sharing situation with them says a lot about what he'd achieved in the last year or so. But it's not a marriage meant to last, and these two young men really do not get on.
This surfaced at a meeting in Peebles.
John Comyn leapt at Robert Bruce.
Treachery to who, John? To your rightful king. A king? A king I don't believe in.
It is not surprising that the guardianship didn't last much longer than that. They needed a referee.
The king the rest of the country follows, apart from your treacherous family!
The Commons are suspicious that the Bruces are pushing their cause, trying to get the Bruce family claim to the throne revived, because they would argue Baleal's not coming home.
This is not the place, John.
There are many examples of physical violence going on between them. And by 1299, the Bishop of St Andrews, William Lamberton, is placed as a third guardian to try and keep the peace between the two of them. By 1300, Bruce is out.
But for Bruce, his time as Scottish guardian gives him grounding in the politics of the country, and serves to hone his opinions on the future direction Scotland must take.
He must have realised that the system of guardianship was only temporary, was only ever temporary, and it couldn't be a permanent solution to the absence of a monarch in Scotland.
Contemporaries seem to suggest that it was from 1297 onwards, that he was fixed on that object. He would use whatever means was necessary to gain the Scottish kingship.
But claiming the Scottish throne will require Bruce reckoning with one of the most powerful men in the world. Edward I remains set on the final conquest of the Scots. But in the years following his victory at Falkirk, Edward cannot turn his full attention to Scotland.
There was no massive invasion before 1303, simply because the English had their problems elsewhere. Warfare in France, and also internal dissension within the Kingdom of England.
He has more than enough problems at home, chiefly financial and also recruiting. So it's very difficult for him to even maintain the existing garrisons that he has in Scotland, let alone recruit an army to come and fight here.
But as one king turns his eye away from Scotland, so another is able to focus on it once again.
A lot of people think that Baleal is coming back to Scotland. He's been let out of English custody to papal custody, and in 1301 he's released from papal custody to French custody, which is effectively saying, go home, go back to France, and take an army to Scotland.
For 5 years, border skirmishes between England and Scotland have focused on Bruce's lands. In siding with the Scots, he's given up his standing and holdings in England. He's gambled all to get closer to power. But now, John Baleal is set to deny his claim to the throne once again.
Robert decided once again, my future is better secured with an English allegiance rather than a Scottish one, which was perfectly true. He was a bitter enemy of the Baleals, after all, and if Baleal had come back as king, there's clearly no future for the Bruces.
In 1302, Robert Bruce again switches his allegiance, submitting to Edward and asking forgiveness.
Robert Bruce, in homage and faith of the King of England, rose in rebellion through evil counsel, and has submitted himself to the same king in hope of his good grace.
I think King Edward was very glad, in one sense, that Robert Bruce had come back into his circle, as it were. I mean, I'm sure that King Edward saw him as a man of great promise.
The king, for the sake of the good service Robert has promised to render in the future, has declared his grace and will.
The Bruces are still after the crown. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And if Baleal's going to come back, that's it for Bruce, the youngest Bruce.
And because it is feared that Scotland may be removed out of the king's hands and handed over to Sir John Baleal, the king grants to Robert that he may pursue his right.
He was definitely a politician, and if he could reach the throne, then he could achieve what he wanted. But until that point, what he basically had to do was survive, as it turned out, at any cost.
There is no doubt whatsoever that Bruce was always brought up to believe that the Bruces had a very strong claim to the Scottish kingship. I think he never lost sight of that. He was trained to think about it, to concentrate on it, to think of any opportunities which might actually have a successful outcome. There is therefore absolutely no doubt that Bruce was almost obsessed with the idea that a Bruce should be King of Scots.
Bruce's obsession has led him to an alliance with Scotland's greatest enemy. Now the former guardian of Scotland is no longer a campaigner for Scottish freedom. And the champion of this time is another, Bruce's bitter rival, John Comyn.
John Comyn was accepted as the leader of the Scottish political community.
It's actually John Comyn of Badenoch who could claim to have the best claim to be the next King of Scots. They may already begin to think in those terms.
In 1303, Bruce taking the Scottish crown seems all but impossible. But the political scene is set to change dramatically. A weakened France is forced to withdraw its interest in Scottish affairs and end its war with England. Without French backing, the threat of a Baleal return is gone.
By 1303, Edward's campaigns were coming to a climax, and he was being very successful indeed. He then decided to turn his attention, finally in his view, to Scotland.
Edward's peace treaty with France is cemented by the betrothal of his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, to Isabel, daughter of the King of France. As his focus turns back to Scotland, Edward sets a date for his army to assemble for full-scale invasion, May of 1303.
Dispatch immediately. You do realize, do not, this is our finest opportunity to conquer the Scots?
I do indeed.
From that point, you can see Edward thinking, right, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this properly, and I don't care how long it takes.
We need to raise a strong army to overwinter in Scotland.
He set about a second conquest of the kingdom.
You take your army up the west coast. I shall proceed up the east coast.
If there's one thing about Edward I, if he starts a job, he will finish it.
It will be a very long, hard winter. Let us proceed.
By May, the English have assembled an army of unprecedented size on the Scottish border. It's a force against which the Scots have no chance of success.
The English army is just very much larger, and in particular area, the number of men-at-arms, that's armoured cavalry, knights in armour if you like, the English element is very much larger than the Scottish body of men-at-arms by a factor of 3, 4, 5 to 1, maybe more than that.
The campaign of 1303 sees Edward earn the name the Hammer of the Scots. John Cummin, leading the Scottish resistance, signs a peace treaty in February of 1304. By spring, only the mighty fortress of Stirling Castle is left to be taken.
Edward had a new toy called the Warwolf, which he wanted to see in action.
Which is probably a trebuchet type thing, a catapult. And he blasted the walls of Stirling Castle.
Trebuchet shoots a missile, which hopefully explodes and causes lots of damage on the target.
And the besieged said, "We surrender, we surrender." And he said, "No, stay there until I test out the machine a bit further."
They refused to submit when he asked them to, therefore they've got to take this. That's the rules of the war, and he takes it again to the limit. And it's a rather distasteful episode and does, his PR in Scotland no good. But, from his point of view, that's my right.
Robert Bruce remains on the English side against the Cummin-led Scotland. At this time, the future king appears the loyal English noble.
Once Bruce re-entered Edward's peace, he really did become fairly committed. He was Sheriff of Lanark and Ayr, for example.
He could not, at this point, be regarded as anything other than a supporter of Edward I.
But later we know that he had other ideas, other motives for doing this.
Whilst both Edward and John Cummin are engaged in war, Bruce has begun to form new alliances. With Scottish resistance subdued, Bruce has been able to move himself closer to power.
In 1304, Bruce makes a pact with Bishop William Lamberton of St Andrews, really a promise of mutual aid in the future.
It's a bond which obviously speaks to Bruce preparing the ground, thinking about persuading enough Scots that, look, it's fairly clear Baleal's not coming back, why not back me?
So we see here a rather elaborate scheme, if you like, of compacts, agreements and whatnot evolving. Something is in the wind, something is changing. We don't exactly know what yet, but something is definitely brewing.
The time to sort this out is approaching, John. You know it as well as I.
Bruce had realised he had to come to some kind of arrangement with John Cummin, not only personally for Cummin's own claim, but also Cummin as representative of the Baleal faction, as it were.
So, what do you propose?
And what they came up with, according to some chroniclers, was the idea that if one went for the kingship, he would surrender his lands to the other.
Whatever you would lose in title, you would gain in land.
Bruce would have had to come up with some sort of deal with John Cummin, so there may well be some truth in it, and it's English that we get hints of this deal from both English and Scottish sources.
Are you seriously saying you've enough backing to move for the crown? With your support, aye. Aye, I do.
With Cummin's support, Bruce is again moving to take the Scottish throne. But the chronicles tell us that far from an ally, he still had a bitter enemy in John Cummin.
We're told that this would mean that Bruce was guilty of treason against Edward I, and so Cummin blabbed to the English king.
It's a great story. It's come down through myth and legend that Bruce was in London, was tipped off by his cousin, the Earl of Gloucester, that Cummin had betrayed him, that King Edward was out for his blood.
A message for you, sire.
Through the night, he was warned by the Earl of Gloucester, who sent him a shilling and a pair of spurs.
With a simple message that on the shilling is the face of the king, and here are some spurs.
As a hint to hop it quick because Edward I is out for him.
By January of 1306, Robert Bruce, who for 4 years has been an ally of Edward I, has become one of his most dangerous enemies.
Obviously, Edward was not pleased that Bruce had been doing this, and so, yes, it was just as well that Bruce did get out and back to Scotland when he did.
The story of his flight from danger has become a part of Bruce's legend. But it's certain that in 1306, the man who changed his allegiance so many times would never again return to England as a friend. The truth of whether John Cummin really betrayed Bruce has been lost down the centuries, but history does show that in February of 1306, the two rivals held a fateful meeting.
We know from what happened in 1299 that they had already come to blows. We know that they had an extremely difficult relationship.
If you didn't trust the person that you were meeting, then to meet in a church was a good idea because it was a safe sanctuary.
My good Lord of Annandale, how goes the day with you?
I'm well, John.
They wanted the sanctuary of the altar, which would preserve one another, which would mean there was no betrayal of trust.
So, what's to discuss now?
Clearly, Robert Bruce thought that John Cummin had betrayed him to Edward I.
Come on, Robert. Out with it.
You know well, John.
The best guess as to what they wished to discuss was their respective futures.
Either they were discussing who should be king and how they would arrange that, or Bruce was going to give Comyn a piece of his mind about why did you tell Edward I all of this.
The problem with that is, Robert, is the throne is not empty. The throne is occupied by my kinsman. Any talk else is talk of treason.
You watch your words.
We know from 1299 that Cummin was not exactly the most diplomatic of individuals.
Are you seriously suggesting removing John Baleal from his anointed throne?
John Baleal is not coming back.
After mutual recriminations, accusations no doubt of betrayal.
Typical of your family. You have the voice and guise of a traitor.
By the end of it, they were screaming and shouting at each other.
Final warning, John.
That was in the church, is it, Robert?
It is not unsurprising that the two men came to blows.
You have surrendered to rulers and kingdoms.
Robert Bruce lost his temper and stabbed John Cummin.
Let's go. Come on. All that we know was at the end of the day, Cummin was dead, and Bruce was free to take forward his claim to the throne.
The meeting in Greyfriars Church takes only minutes. By its end, John Cummin and his kinsman lay slain, and the course of Scottish history has been forever changed.
Most historians appear to believe that this act was committed in hot blood. In other words, it was not premeditated.
Bruce knew that having done it, he was a dead man, or as good as, because the Commons were going to come after him. Never mind Edward I.
We cannot stress enough, this was the worst possible thing for a man who's making a bid for the kingship of anywhere. He kills a person at the altar, which means he's immediately excommunicated.
In the longer term, it's probably best for Bruce that he did kill Comyn, because he was going to be a thorn in his side no matter what. But at the time, it must have seemed like the whole world had come down.
With the killing of John Cummin, Robert Bruce has placed himself in the weakest position of his life. He's deemed a traitor by the King of England and has killed the most powerful man in Scotland.
Timing is everything. If he stands there and does nothing, it's the end for him. But if he makes a move, as long as it's quick, he has got Scotland.
His only hope lies in seeking forgiveness and support from the Scottish Church.
The Scottish Church at this time could be seen as a sort of custodian of patriotism almost. The bishops, or some of them, at this period, were really just soldiers dressed up in bishops' outfits. You know, they were warriors at heart, and they conducted themselves like warriors.
He gives an oath of allegiance to support the Scottish Church. He's exonerated he's given absolution by Bishop of Glasgow, so at least he knows that the domestic church in Scotland is with him.
Bruce is now the only viable candidate to take the Scottish throne. With the church on his side, he is able to rally enough support to be named as the next King of Scots. On the 25th of March, 1306, 10 years to the day after hostilities against the English began, Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, Lord of Annandale, becomes King Robert I of Scotland at Scone Abbey.
His enthronement marks for him a very personal moment of transformation, and from that moment on, he is the physical leader of his people, and in his hands, in his life, is represented the success or failure of Scotland as an independent nation.
But for Bruce, it's not the crowning he'd planned. He is King of Scots, but a king still to reclaim his kingdom.
Well, the coronation was a turning point rather than an end result for Bruce. There was a lot of work to do, and it is known that he was crowned a hated man, and he was going to have to work hard to earn the respect of his countrymen.
Bruce's enthronement is by no means the beginning of an open chapter in Scottish history. It's potentially the most dangerous time in his reign, where he has both a domestic enemy and a foreign enemy, and they're closing in on him very rapidly.
The odds against him in spring of 1306 are huge. 1,000 to 1, 1,000,000 to 1, really, if you're being honest. He has essentially got most of England and Scotland against him.
This makes no sense whatsoever. I want this report confirmed.
Well, apparently Edward I was so incandescent once he found out that it really was Bruce, and then had gone on 6 weeks later to take the throne of Scotland.
That does not matter. All the indications are that Robert the Bruce did this.
Robert the Bruce. He has no support in Scotland whatsoever.
This time he had some grounds for it. I mean, it was utter ingratitude, as well as, you know, an absolutely appalling and sacrilegious murder.
I want that report confirmed again, and I want it done now! Stand back, I don't need you.
Well, as far as Edward is concerned, again, Bruce has put himself and anybody else that supports him completely beyond the pale.
Raise dragon. We will show no mercy.
They are no longer human, and that means that Edward can do what he wants with them, and it's the dragon banner, as they say, that means that there will be no quarter given.
Within months of Bruce's enthronement, Edward's wrath has all but ended his reign. English forces destroy the bulk of Bruce's army at Perth. By the end of 1306, Bruce is in hiding, his kingdom reduced to the tiny island of Rathlin near the Irish coast. Unsuccessful so far in capturing the Scottish king, Edward has taken vengeance on the Bruce family, executing 3 of Bruce's brothers and taking his wife and daughter prisoner.
This man, this intensely family man, to be separated from his wife, to be separated from his family, to have his brothers executed, is quite clear that the English, in the presence of King Edward, were determined to stamp out the Bruce claim physically and to end it. It ends here with the death of King Robert, but he survived.
By February of 1307, Bruce has returned to the mainland in a final desperate bid to claim Scotland. Landing in his earldom at Carrick, he gathers his remaining supporters, but with the forces ranged against him, he has little hope.
Bruce seems to start to enjoy some military success after he recognises once and for all that the set-piece battle is not going to work for him, and that he should probably revert to some sort of guerrilla tactics.
The course of the war has reverted back to the normal practice of medieval war, which is small bodies of men-at-arms chasing around the countryside, having clashes and fights to try and dominate territory.
But at Loudon Hill in Ayrshire, Edward's forces finally catch up with Bruce. The brooding Tor becomes the site of an all-or-nothing confrontation with the English.
Loudon Hill's a kind of recovery point for King Robert. You know, until now, things have not really been going all that terribly well, but this is a small battle perhaps, but a proper battle in the open field. He chooses a battlefield which is narrow. It's a roadway between 2 morasses, 2 swamps. That forces the English cavalry to concentrate, to attack him on a very narrow front. And he can deal with that. It's a victory.
We're told by contemporaries that immediately the Battle of Loudon Hill gave Bruce credibility because people believed in him. They believed there were possibilities here. No longer was he the no-hoper fighting against absolutely overwhelming odds. Suddenly people began to wonder, could we just be onto a winner? And of course they were.
Following Loudon Hill, a devastating account of Bruce's progress is sent to King Edward.
Sir Robert de Bruce never had the goodwill of his own followers or the people at large so much with him as now, for he has destroyed all King Edward's power both among the English and the Scots, and the English force is in retreat to its own country, not to return.
For Edward I, this has gone on long enough. If his nobles cannot destroy Bruce, he will do the job himself.
Edward decides to lead an army north himself, despite his age. He's in his late 60s and his infirmity, vowing to crush Bruce and all his supporters. He's quite ruthless on that.
By 1307, Edward himself comes up with an army, but he's a very ill man, and he makes it into southwest Scotland, but has to turn back. He's in a litter by this time.
The exertion of yet another war campaign proves too much. By July 1307, Edward I, King of England, is dead. He dies within sight of the Scottish border, the land that had been the obsession of the last years of his life.
And of course he dies at Barrow Sands, just near Carlisle, looking across the Solway at Scotland, which he cannot get at, and that man who has done these terrible things. And he basically says to Edward II, who obviously will become king in a day or so, to boil me up and put my bones in front of the army that you will continue to lead into Scotland and finish the job. And he also says that he should not be buried in a proper kind of sarcophagus, that he should just lie in a lead box in Westminster Abbey until the Scots are subdued, and he still lies in that lead box.
You have surrendered to rulers and kings.
Second, after the death of his father Edward I, inherits a pretty troubled kingdom in England. There's a great deal of noble dissension. The nobles are against many of the policies introduced by Edward I. There's a certain war weariness around, I think, with both France and Scotland. A certain lack of a desire to continue these apparently pointless campaigns to the north. And so Edward is in trouble.
For the new English king, the next 6 years are a dangerous transition. His kingdom teeters constantly on the brink of civil war, and he can muster only limited armies to campaign in Scotland. But these forces cannot secure a decisive victory, and are rarely able even to engage the Scottish king in battle.
As a general rule, King Robert goes out of his way to avoid major field engagements for the best of all possible reasons. He knows that an English army, and that's always who he's going to have to fight, is likely to be much stronger than his army. And he doesn't need to fight battles. What he needs is to not lose his war.
He had to be dynamic but subtle. He had to use surprise attacks. He had to isolate his enemies in Scotland and one by one take them out of the equation.
Slowly, King Robert the Bruce takes back his realm, but with the might of England a constant threat, the tactics he employs must be ruthless.
King Robert's Scorched Earth policy demonstrates very clearly his iron will and his utter determination. You could argue that it's actually his weapon of first response. When an English army moves into Scotland, that's about the first thing he does, is he scorches the earth in front of them. But that's really his most important strategic gambit. It's the most effective thing he can do.
Determined to retake all of Scotland, Bruce lays waste to Scottish lands rather than see them fall to the English. But a final conflict with England is inevitable before Scotland can truly be his.
Well, by 1313, Bruce has every castle in Scotland bar Stirling and Berwick. And Stirling is next on his hit list.
As is well known, Bruce had always tried to avoid pitched battle, but his hot-headed brother, Edward Bruce, makes a deal with the constable of Stirling Castle that if it's not relieved by midsummer of 1314, then the castle would be surrendered to the Scots. He thus creates the situation for the very battle that Bruce had spent his life trying to avoid. And that's the background, really, to Bannockburn.
The deal at Stirling becomes a boost to Edward's authority. English eyes turn away from domestic turmoil, given focus by the chance finally to crush the Scots in open battle. The call for the liberation of the mighty fortress is soon sent throughout the English realm. The king is to lead the army himself.
Edward II's army at Bannockburn is one of the biggest armies ever raised in medieval England. It's absolutely enormous by the standards of the time.
Bruce does make efforts to train his men, and mean that although it may be small in numbers, it knows what it's doing, which is not always the case in Scotland.
Bruce was definitely more war-hardened. He had been campaigning now for 8 years, after all. But Edward, although he was perhaps comparatively untested, had had the advantage of being raised as a knight and a person who would one day be king. So he had a pretty shrewd grasp of military tactics as well.
It seems most likely that the Scots are outnumbered to the tune of 2 to 1 or possibly more. But the number of people involved in a battle, the number of people in one army or the other in a battle, isn't really a good guide as to who's going to be victorious. It's very easy to say God's on the side of the big battalions, but actually if you thought of the names of half a dozen different battles, probably the majority of the ones that you've come up with would be ones where the smaller army has defeated the larger army.
Bruce's only advantage is that he can pick his battleground, a stretch of land near Stirling Castle around the Bannockburn.
The Scots knew the land. They also knew that the land was pretty treacherous underfoot. Lots of water about, lots of mud, lots of swamp, all the rest of it. Wouldn't be good for English cavalry, for example, who are very heavily armoured, likely to sink.
The choice of ground forces the English to both approach from a particular direction and take a route which draws them through these palls, these streams and marshes.
By the 23rd of June, the armies of the King of Scots and the King of England face each other at Bannockburn. Each man faces what will prove to be the defining battle of his life.
There's a very famous incident just at the beginning of the Battle of Bannockburn when Bruce is supposedly addressing his men out in front of the army when an English knight, Sir Henry de Bohun, sees his opportunity for immortality.
The battle hasn't started yet. Bruce isn't actually equipped for battle.
De Bohun sees King Robert lightly armoured, maybe on a pony,
and thinks, well, if I knock him off, that's my name made.
The lance goes into the attack position and De Bohun sets off at the gallop.
And Bruce turns, sees what's happening, realises he can't turn and run. That would be a bad example to his troops.
Bruce has very limited options, but the mark of the man, a man skilled in hand-to-hand combat, a man who's had to defend his own life on more than one occasion, just jinks his horse to the side, allows De Bohun's impetus to carry him past, and with a deft sweep of his axe, that's lights out for De Bohun.
Bruce gains such accolade for this act that he's immediately made a legend, if you like. It's the greatest possible sort of fillip you could get at the beginning of a battle. Bruce and De Bohun were fighting for the crown. Bruce took his battle axe and knocked De Bohun down.
Prepare to advance!
The Battle of Bannockburn has begun. Bruce's forces immediately begin attacking as a schiltron, a body of spearmen. In a tactic that has worked for Bruce before, he hems the English into a narrow space.
It's not that they don't have plenty of soldiers, they just can't deploy them properly because they're bottled up into a relatively small area. And as long as these great Scottish schiltrons keep pressing forward, they're not going to get the room to deploy properly, so they're forced back into the River Forth.
He conned the English into finding themselves in dangerous waters, literally in very bad land for mounted knights and so on, where they could just be picked off by the Scots.
To pierce the wall of Scottish spears, Edward uses the tried and tested method of medieval warfare. Skilled battalions of archers rain arrows onto the advancing Scots.
The archers do take up position and start firing into the Scottish spearmen, who in turn start dropping dead in largish quantities. But before the English archers can really make a great impact on the face of the battle, King Robert's cavalry appear and just thrust them from the battlefield.
With both the English cavalry and the archers ineffective, there is little Edward can do. Despite his overwhelming advantage of numbers, his forces are unable to manoeuvre, and he cannot stop the Scots forcing them back to the water.
No, I will not flee. The battle is not yet done. We will fight on.
By the second day of fighting, the Scots forces are closing in on King Edward himself.
He wasn't keen to leave. Plenty of contemporary writers have a great many criticisms to make of Edward II, but none of them suggest that he's anything other than brave. So he's keen to fight, but The bodyguards are keen that he should not be captured or killed in action.
When the royal standard departs the field, the English forces begin to scatter. Bannockburn becomes the most legendary victory in Scotland's history. King Robert the Bruce will never again face such a challenge to his reign. In the years that follow, he sets about the rebuilding of Scotland as a nation.
Bruce realised that as long as people's first loyalty was to their family, you were never going to go very far as king. Everybody's going to react in the future as he did when he headed up the Bruces. So what you do is you try to come up with ideas which will transcend individual particularisms. And what he comes up with is really the idea of the nation, that there's something up there above us all to which we can aspire.
Scotland continues to unify behind Bruce, and by 1320, the nation issues the now famous Declaration of Arbroath. It would become forever enshrined as the definitive assertion of Scottish freedom.
The Declaration of Arbroath, 6th April 1320, is actually a letter written to the Pope at Avignon, asking him to bring pressure to bear on Edward II to recognise the legitimacy of Robert Bruce's title, King of Scots. For so long as 100 of us remain alive, we shall never surrender. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest person will lose, but with life itself. So it moves from Scotland's particular predicament to an appeal to universal human dignity and the absolutely brilliant concept of freedom.
Edward II will never recognise Scotland's independence. Only after his death in 1327 is a final peace treaty signed acknowledging Scotland's sovereignty. And in the end, when the crowns of the nations are joined, it's Bruce's descendant, not Edward's, that takes the throne.
It could be seen as somewhat ironic that a lineal descendant of Robert Bruce actually succeeds to the throne of England in 1603, James VI, who, by the way, was very, very conscious and proud of his descent from Robert Bruce. After all, Robert Bruce was seen as one of the greatest, most successful kings that Scotland ever had.
In 1329, a year after the sovereignty of his nation is assured, Robert I, King of Scots, dies. His remains are today entombed in Dunfermline Abbey.
Robert Bruce was a great King of Scots. He was exactly what Scotland needed, although he nearly destroyed Scotland with what he did to John Comyn in the beginning.
He's a very strong image. Good King Robert, so he tends to be remembered, the victor of Bannockburn, a man who pays a terrible price, fights a terribly long, hard struggle to get where he does, and then rules well.
King Robert was probably the most successful king of Scotland, a man who started with nothing, physically started with nothing, but also the kingdom of Scots did not exist in one sense when he was enthroned.
Robert Bruce secured the independence of the Scottish nation once and for all. He had his title recognised. He brought about peace through treaty with the English. He rebuilt his kingdom after a disastrous series of wars. I see Bruce as one of the most remarkable figures to come out of the pages of Scottish history, no question.